She thought she was just covering a stranger's tab, $18.50 that she couldn't afford to lose. But when a black limousine pulled up to the diner the very next day, Sapphire Bennett realized that her act of kindness had triggered a chain reaction she never saw coming. It wasn't just about a free meal. It was about a hidden identity, a vicious family feud, and a secret that had been buried for 40 years. What happens when the person you save turns out to be the one holding the keys to your destruction or your salvation? This is the story of the dinner that changed everything. The rain in Seattle doesn't wash things clean. It just makes the grime slicker. It was a Tuesday night in November, the kind of night that seeps into your bones and makes you question every life choice that led you to standing in orthopedic shoes on a grease-stained tile floor. Sapphire Bennett wiped down counter number 4 for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. She was 26, but her eyes carried the weight of someone twice her age. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a fraying ponytail, and her name tag was slightly crooked. In her apron pocket, her phone buzzed. She didn't need to look at it to know what it was. A text from her landlord, Mrs. Higgins. The rent was 3 days late. Again. Sapphire, stop daydreaming and refill the ketchup on table 6. The voice belonged to Gary, the night manager of Miller's Diner on 4th Avenue. Gary was a man who believed that if his employees weren't miserable, they weren't working. He stood by the pass-through window, his face shining with sweat, wiping his hands on a rag that was arguably dirtier than the floor. "On it, Gary," Sapphire said, her voice flat. She grabbed the ketchup bottle and moved to table 6, dodging a busboy carrying a tray of dirty dishes. Miller's Diner was a staple of the neighborhood, a place where the coffee was strong, the pie was decent, and the clientele ranged from exhausted nurses to construction workers coming off the late shift. But tonight, due to the torrential downpour, the place was mostly empty, except for the man in the corner booth. He had come in around 8 p.m., shaking off a soaking wet trench coat that looked like it had been bought during the Carter administration. He was old, maybe late 70s, perhaps early 80s, with thinning white hair plastered to his skull and hands that trembled slightly as he held the menu. He hadn't said much, just pointed to the meatloaf special. Sapphire had served him. She noticed the way he ate, slowly, savoring every bite, as if he wasn't sure when the next meal was coming. He looked disheveled. There was a stain on his collar, and his cuffs were frayed. In a city full of tech millionaires and rising rents, he looked like one of the many who had been left behind. As Sapphire finished refilling the ketchup, she heard a commotion from the corner booth. She looked up to see the old man patting his pockets frantically. He stood up, checking the coat he had hung on the rack, then checked his pants pockets again. His face, previously pale, was flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. Gary had seen it too. He marched out from behind the counter like a bulldog spotting a postman. "Is there a problem here?" Gary asked, his voice booming in the quiet diner. The old man looked up, his eyes watery behind thick glasses. I seem to have misplaced my wallet. I had it when I left the apartment. I know I did." Gary crossed his arms. Misplaced it, or didn't have it to begin with? "I assure you," the man said, his voice shaking. "I can pay. I just need to go home and get it. I live just a few blocks away at the St. Jude Senior Center. I can come back tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Gary scoffed. "Look, Pop, I've heard this story 1,000 times. You come in, you eat the meatloaf, you forget your wallet. It's a scam. The bill is $18.50. You pay now, or I call the cops." The diner went silent. The few other customers looked down at their plates, unwilling to get involved. "Please," the man said, his dignity crumbling. "I'm not a thief. My name is Arthur. Arthur Caldwell. You can look me up." "I don't care if you're the King of England," Gary snapped. "You don't pay. You don't leave without a police escort. I'm sick of you vagrants thinking Miller's is a soup kitchen." Gary reached for the phone on the counter. Sapphire felt a knot of nausea in her stomach. She looked at Arthur. He was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He looked terrified. 18 $50. That was 2 hours of work for Sapphire. It was the money she needed to buy formula for her 11-month-old daughter, Chloe, who was currently being watched by a neighbor Sapphire couldn't afford to pay. But she couldn't watch this. "Gary, stop," Sapphire said, stepping between the manager and the old man. Gary glared at her. "Stay out of this, Bennett." "He's not a vagrant, Gary. Look at him." Sapphire turned to the register and pulled out her own worn leather wallet. She opened it. She had a $20 bill and 3 ones. That was it until payday on Friday. She pulled out the 20. "Here," she said, slamming the bill onto the counter. "I'm paying for his meal. Keep the change." Gary looked at the money, then at Sapphire, then at Arthur. He sneered. "Fine. If you want to throw your money away on a bum, that's your business. But don't come crying to me when you're short on your drawer count." Gary snatched the bill and stomped back to the kitchen. Sapphire turned to Arthur. The old man was staring at her, his mouth slightly open. The shame in his eyes had been replaced by something else, shock and a deep, penetrating curiosity. "You didn't have to do that, miss," Arthur whispered. "It's okay," Sapphire said, forcing a smile, though her heart was racing about the money she just lost. "Everyone has a bad day. You just get home safe, okay? It's slippery out there." Arthur slowly put his coat on. He buttoned it with trembling fingers. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small red notebook and a pen. He scribbled something on a page, tore it out, and placed it on the table. "What is your name?" he asked. "Sapphire," she said. "Sapphire Bennett." "Sapphire Bennett," he repeated, testing the weight of the name. "I won't forget this, Sapphire. Thank you." He didn't offer to pay her back. He didn't promise to return. He just turned and walked out into the cold Seattle rain, a lonely figure dissolving into the night. Sapphire looked at the table. The piece of paper he had left wasn't money. It wasn't a contact number. It was a drawing, a quick, shaky but incredibly detailed sketch of a sparrow sitting on a branch. Underneath it, he had written, "Even the smallest bird has value." Sapphire sighed, crumbled the paper into her apron pocket, and went back to wiping the tables. She had lost $20, but she had kept her soul. That had to count for something. The next morning, the reality of the $20 hit. Sapphire sat at her small kitchen table in her 1-bedroom apartment in the Rainier Valley district. It was a rough neighborhood, but it was what she could afford. Her daughter Chloe was banging a plastic spoon against the tray of her high chair. "I know, baby, I know," Sapphire murmured, checking her banking app. $42. That was all she had to her name. She had to buy diapers, milk, and put gas in her rusted 2005 Honda Civic to get to work. She rubbed her temples. The memory of the old man, Arthur, felt like a fever dream now. Gary had been riding her all night after the incident, making her scrub the grout in the bathroom as punishment for undermining his authority. She dropped Chloe off at Mrs. Gable's apartment down the hall. Mrs. Gable was a sweet, elderly woman who watched Chloe for cheap, mostly because she was lonely, but Sapphire still owed her $50 from last week. "I'll have it Friday, Mrs. Gable, I promise," Sapphire said, shifting her weight anxiously in the hallway. "Don't you worry, dear. Chloe is an angel," Mrs. Gable said, though her eyes lingered on Sapphire's tired face. You look like you haven't slept." "Just another day in paradise," Sapphire joked weakly. She arrived at Miller's Diner at 10:45 a.m. for the lunch shift. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a bruised purple color, threatening more. The diner was buzzing. The lunch rush was beginning. Sapphire tied her apron on and immediately grabbed a pot of coffee. She was pouring for a regular named Pete when the atmosphere in the diner suddenly shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was a lack of sound. The chatter died down, starting near the front door and rippling backward. Sapphire looked up. Standing in the entryway of Miller's Diner was a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a boardroom in Manhattan. He was tall, wearing a charcoal grey suit that likely cost more than Sapphire's car. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He held a leather briefcase in one hand. He was out of place among the vinyl booths and the smell of frying bacon. Gary, who was usually loud and abrasive, looked stunned. He walked around the counter, wiping his hands on his pants. "Can I help you, sir?" Gary asked, his voice taking on a sycophantic whine he reserved for health inspectors. The man ignored Gary. He scanned the room, his eyes sharp and calculating. He consulted a file he was holding. "I am looking for a Miss Sapphire Bennett," the man said. His voice was a deep baritone, commanding and precise. Sapphire froze. The coffee pot trembled in her hand. Oh God, she thought. The debts. Had the hospital finally sent a collection agency for her appendix surgery from 2 years ago? Or was this about the unpaid parking tickets? Every eye in the diner turned to her. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She wanted to run out the back door, but her feet felt leaden. I'm Sapphire Bennett," she said, her voice small. The man in the suit turned his gaze toward her. He didn't smile. He walked toward her, the sound of his expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum. Gary trailed behind him like a confused puppy. "Miss Bennett," the man said, stopping 2 feet from her. "My name is Robert Halloway. I am an attorney with the firm Halloway, Maximus and Associates." Sapphire's stomach dropped. A lawyer. This was bad. This was very bad. "Am I in trouble?" she asked. "Is there somewhere private we can speak?" Halloway asked, glancing disdainfully at the half-eaten stack of pancakes on the table next to them. "She's on the clock," Gary interjected, trying to regain control. "If this is personal business—" Halloway turned to Gary. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was icy. "This is a legal matter regarding the estate of one of my clients. Unless you wish to be named in an obstruction lawsuit, I suggest you give Miss Bennett a moment." Gary's mouth snapped shut. He waved a hand dismissively at Sapphire. "Go. Take your break early." Sapphire untied her apron, her hands shaking. She led Mr. Halloway to the back booth, the one furthest from the kitchen. It was relatively quiet there. She sat down, gripping her hands in her lap. Halloway sat opposite her, placing his briefcase on the table. He clicked the latches open. "Miss Bennett," Halloway began, "do you recall an interaction you had last night with a gentleman named Arthur Caldwell?" Sapphire blinked. The old man, the one with the meatloaf? "Arthur? Yes, is he okay? Did he get home safe?" Halloway paused. His professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing something akin to sadness. "Mr. Caldwell passed away early this morning, Miss Bennett." Sapphire gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh no. Oh, that's terrible. He was just here. He seemed fine. I mean, he was frail, but he suffered a massive cardiac event in his sleep," Halloway said. "The staff at the St. Jude Center found him at 6 a.m. "I'm so sorry," Sapphire said, and she meant it. She remembered the drawing of the sparrow. Even the smallest bird has value. "Mr. Caldwell was a complicated man," Halloway continued. "He had been my client for over 30 years. While he lived a modest life in his later years, he was a man of significant foresight. Halloway pulled a thick document out of his briefcase. This morning, per his instructions, I was notified of his passing. I was also instructed to execute the final addendum to his last will and testament, an addendum he wrote and notarized 3 months ago with a specific trigger clause. Sapphire was confused. I don't understand. What does this have to do with me? Halloway looked her dead in the eye. The trigger clause stated that the beneficiary of his estate would be determined by a specific test. Mr. Caldwell has been wandering the city for the last month, intentionally forgetting his wallet at various establishments. Sapphire's breath hitched. It was a test. He has been thrown out of 5 restaurants, threatened with arrest twice, and ignored by countless people, Halloway said. Last night, you were the first person to intervene. You were the first person to pay for him without asking for anything in return. Halloway slid a business card across the table. Mr. Caldwell has left you something, Miss Bennet. I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for the formal reading of the will. His children, Richard and Beatrice, will also be there. His children? Sapphire asked. He has family. He does, Halloway said, his face tightening. And I must warn you, Miss Bennet. They are not pleasant people. They were under the impression that they were the sole heirs to the Caldwell fortune. Fortune? Sapphire laughed nervously. Mr. Halloway, he couldn't pay for an $18 meatloaf. He lived at a senior center. Halloway stood up, clasping his briefcase shut. He looked down at Sapphire, and for the first time, a small, grim smile touched his lips. Mr. Caldwell was the founder of Caldwell Logistics, Miss Bennet. He owned half the shipping containers you see in the port of Seattle. He didn't live at the senior center because he was poor. He lived there because he was hiding. Sapphire sat frozen, the noise of the diner fading into a dull roar. Hiding from who? She whispered. From the people you're going to meet tomorrow, Halloway said. Don't be late. And Miss Bennet, bring a lawyer if you can find one. You're going to need it. The offices of Halloway, Maximus and Associates were located on the 42nd floor of the Columbia Center. The elevator ride up made Sapphire's ears pop, a physical reminder that she was ascending into a world where oxygen and money was thinner and harder to hold on to. She had spent the last 24 hours in a state of panic. She didn't have a lawyer. She couldn't afford one. She had Googled Legal Aid Seattle, but the waiting list was weeks long. So, she walked in alone, wearing her best outfit, a pair of black slacks from Target and a white button-down shirt that she had ironed 3 times. She still felt like she had diner waitress stamped on her forehead in neon ink. When the elevator doors slid open, the reception area smelled of expensive leather and lemon polish. A receptionist with perfect hair gestured her toward a heavy double door at the end of the hall. Sapphire pushed the doors open. It was a conference room, dominated by a long mahogany table that shone like a dark mirror. At the far end sat Robert Halloway. To his right and left sat 2 people who looked like they had been carved out of ice. "Ah, Miss Bennet, right on time," Halloway said, standing up. "Please take a seat." He gestured to the empty chair at the foot of the table, directly opposite him. This placement felt deliberate. It put her in the direct line of fire of the other 2. "Is this her?" The woman to the left spoke. She was in her late 40s, with hair dyed a severe jet black and a face pulled tight by expensive surgeries. She wore a cream-colored suit and was sipping from a bottle of sparkling water as if it were wine. "She looks like she sells knockoff handbags out of a trunk." "Beatrice, please," Halloway warned. "Let's just get this over with." the man on the right grumbled. He was large, thick-necked, wearing a navy pinstripe suit that strained at the buttons. He had Arthur's eyes, but none of the warmth. This was Richard Caldwell. "We know the drill, Halloway. Dad left a few thousand to the SPCA, maybe a trust for the grandkids he never saw, and the rest reverts to the family trust. Just read it so I can make my tea time." Sapphire sat down, placing her worn purse on the floor. She felt small. These people radiated a kind of aggression she wasn't used to. It wasn't the drunken anger of a diner patron. It was the cold, entitled fury of people who believed the world owed them everything. Halloway put on his reading glasses. "This is the last will and testament of Arthur James Caldwell. As I mentioned to Miss Bennet yesterday, this version supersedes all previous drafts." Richard checked his Rolex, bored. Beatrice was typing on her phone. "To my children, Richard and Beatrice," Halloway read, his voice steady. "I leave you the sum of $500,000 each." Richard froze. Beatrice dropped her phone on the table with a clatter. "Excuse me?" Richard said, his voice dropping an octave. "Did you say 500,000? You missed a few zeros, Robert. The estate is valued at 400 million. "I read what is written, Richard," Halloway said calmly. "Your father was very specific. He wrote, 'I leave this sum in the hopes that you might finally learn the value of $1, though I doubt it. You have spent your lives waiting for me to die, rather than living your own.'" "This is insanity," Beatrice hissed, standing up. "He was senile. We'll contest this. We'll bury this will in probate for a decade." "Let him finish," Sapphire said. Her voice was shaky, but loud enough to cut through the tension. Richard whipped his head toward her. "Shut up. You don't even belong here." "Actually," Halloway interjected, "she is the only reason we are here. To continue. To the remainder of my estate, including the controlling 51% share of Caldwell Logistics, the real estate portfolio in downtown Seattle, and the liquid assets currently held in the Cayman Trust." The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "I leave to the individual who passed my final test. I leave it to the person who saw a human being in need, rather than a nuisance. I leave it, in its entirety, to Sapphire Bennet." The silence stretched for 3 seconds, and then it shattered. Richard slammed his fist onto the table so hard the water pitcher jumped. "You have got to be kidding me. Her? The waitress? She's a grifter!" Beatrice screamed, her poise vanishing. "She probably drugged him. She targeted him." "Miss Bennet had no idea who Arthur was," Halloway said, closing the folder. "Unlike you two, who haven't visited your father in 3 years, she sat with him. She fed him. She treated him with dignity." Richard stood up, his face purple with rage. He walked around the table toward Sapphire. He was a big man, and he used his size to intimidate. He loomed over her chair, leaning down until she could smell the coffee and mint on his breath. "Listen to me, you little gutter rat," Richard snarled. "I don't know what game you're playing, or what you did to my father's brain, but you will not see a dime of this money. Do you understand? I have lawyers who cost more per hour than you make in a year. I will sue you until you don't even own the clothes on your back." Sapphire's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to cry. She wanted to run. But then she thought of Gary yelling at the old man. She thought of Arthur's trembling hands. She thought of her daughter, Chloe, wearing hand-me-down shoes. She stood up. She wasn't tall, but she locked eyes with Richard. "I didn't ask for this," Sapphire said, her voice trembling but firm. "I didn't know he was rich. I just bought him dinner. Something you clearly never did." Richard recoiled as if slapped. "Get out!" Beatrice screeched. Get out of our building." "It's not your building anymore, Beatrice," Holloway said quietly. "Technically it belongs to Miss Bennet now." Richard straightened up, buttoning his jacket. He looked at Sapphire with a look of pure, distilled hatred. It was a look that promised violence, not physical, but the kind that destroys lives through paperwork and influence. "Enjoy the moment, honey," Richard said, his voice terrifyingly calm now. "Because by tomorrow, you're going to wish you had just let the old man starve." He turned and stormed out. Beatrice grabbed her bag, shot a venomous look at Sapphire, and followed him. Sapphire collapsed back into the chair, her legs giving out. "Mr. Holloway, is this real? Can they really take it away?" Holloway took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked exhausted. "It is real, Sapphire." But Richard wasn't lying. "They are going to come at you with everything they have. They will dig into your past. They will try to find dirt. They will try to prove you manipulated Arthur." He reached into his drawer and pulled out a check. "This is an advance from the estate. $10,000. It's for immediate security and expenses." Sapphire stared at the check. It was more money than she had ever held. "Security?" she asked. "Yes," Holloway said gravely. "Arthur knew his children. He knew they wouldn't go quietly. You need to be careful, Sapphire. You just stepped into a tank with 2 very hungry sharks and you're bleeding." Sapphire left the building through the service exit, per Holloway's advice, just in case the press had already been tipped off. The check burned in her pocket. $10,000. She could pay Mrs. Gable. She could pay the rent for 6 months. She could buy Chloe a new winter coat. But as she walked to the bus stop, her car hadn't started that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Richard's eyes haunted her. "By tomorrow, you're going to wish you had just let the old man starve." She decided to go straight to Mrs. Gable's to pick up Chloe. She needed to hold her daughter. She needed to feel something pure. The bus ride to Rainier Valley took 40 minutes. When she got off, the sky was dark grey, reflecting her mood. She walked up the cracked pavement to her apartment building, a squat 3-story brick structure that smelled of mildew and boiled cabbage. As she approached the front entrance, she saw it. Her belongings. There were 3 trash bags sitting on the curb. A plastic high chair lay on its side in a puddle. A box of clothes had spilled open, soaking her waitress uniforms in the dirty gutter water. Sapphire broke into a run. "No! No, no, no!" She reached the pile. It was her stuff, all of it. She scrambled up the steps to the front door, jamming her key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. The lock had been changed. "Hey, open up!" she screamed, pounding on the door. The door opened. But it wasn't her landlord, Mrs. Higgins. It was a man she didn't recognize. He was wearing a tool belt. "You Sapphire Bennet?" he asked, chewing on a toothpick. "Yes. Why is my stuff on the street? I live here." "Not anymore," the man said. "Landlord sold the building this morning. New owners want the place cleared out for renovations immediately. You were month to month, sweetheart. No lease." "They can't do that," Sapphire cried. "I have rights. They have to give me 30 days. "Talk to the owners," the man said, shrugging. "I'm just the contractor." "Who are the owners?" Sapphire demanded. The man pulled a work order from his pocket and squinted at it. "Company called Caldwell Real Estate Holdings." Sapphire felt the blood drain from her face. Caldwell. It had been 4 hours. 4 hours since the meeting, and Richard had already bought her apartment building just to evict her. It was a flex, a display of power. He was showing her that he could touch her anywhere, any time. "My daughter," Sapphire gasped. "Where is Mrs. Gable? Where is apartment 2B? Old lady?" The contractor pointed down the street. She's sitting in her car. They kicked her out, too. Sapphire sprinted down the block. Mrs. Gable's ancient station wagon was parked by a fire hydrant. The windows were steamed up. Sapphire ripped the back door open. Mrs. Gable was in the driver's seat, sobbing. Chloe was strapped into her car seat in the back, sleeping, clutching a stuffed bear. "Mrs. Gable, I am so sorry," Sapphire choked out, tears streaming down her face. "This is my fault. I'll fix this." "Sapphire, what is going on?" Mrs. Gable wept. "They just came in and told us to leave. They said the building was condemned. I've lived there for 20 years. I know. Sapphire unbuckled Chloe, pulling the sleeping baby into her arms. The baby smelled like milk and safety, the only grounding thing in a world that was spinning off its axis. "I have a sister in Portland," Mrs. Gable said, wiping her eyes. "I'm going to drive down there tonight." "But Sapphire, there was a man." Sapphire froze. "What man?" "While we were waiting, a man in a black car. He came up to the window. He gave me this." Mrs. Gable handed Sapphire a white envelope. Sapphire opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of Sapphire and Chloe at the park from last week, a candid shot, taken from a distance. On the back, written in elegant, sharp cursive, were the words, "Unfit mothers often lose custody. Be smart. Walk away." A scream rose in Sapphire's throat, but she swallowed it down. This wasn't just about money anymore. They were threatening Chloe. She looked at Mrs. Gable. "Go to Portland. Go now. Don't tell anyone where you are." Mrs. Gable nodded, started the engine and drove away, leaving Sapphire standing on the sidewalk in the rain, holding her baby and a trash bag of clothes. She had $10,000 in her pocket, but she had nowhere to go. If she went to a hotel, Richard would find her. If she went to a shelter, they might use it as proof she was homeless and call Child Protective Services. She was trapped. She pulled out her phone. She dialed Holloway's number. It went to voicemail. "Mr. Holloway, they kicked me out. They bought my building. They're threatening my daughter. Please, I don't know what to do." She hung up, panic setting in. She needed a ride. She needed to get off the street. Suddenly, a pair of headlights blinded her. An old, beat-up Ford pickup truck pulled up to the curb, screeching to a halt. The engine rattled and coughed. Sapphire clutched Chloe tighter, stepping back. Was this them? Was this Richard's goons coming to finish the job? The passenger window rolled down with a squeak. "Get in," a gravelly voice said. Sapphire squinted. The driver was a man, maybe 40, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low. He looked rough, dangerous. "Get away from me," Sapphire yelled. "Sapphire, look at me," the man said. He leaned over. In his hand, he held a small, familiar object. It was a red notebook, the same red notebook Arthur Caldwell had used to draw the sparrow. "Who are you?" Sapphire whispered. "Name's Jack," the man said. "I was Arthur's driver for 10 years before he went into hiding. Holloway sent me. He said his office lines are probably tapped." Sapphire hesitated. Every instinct told her not to get in a car with a stranger. But then she looked at the dark street, the eviction notice on her building, and the photograph in her pocket. "He told me to give you the code word," Jack said. He looked at her with eyes that were surprisingly kind. "The sparrow has value." Sapphire let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She opened the door and climbed into the truck, pulling the wet trash bag in after her. "Where are we going?" she asked, as the truck peeled away from the curb. Jack looked in the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning for a tail. "To a safe house," Jack said grimly, "because the war just started, and you're losing." As they drove away, Sapphire looked out the back window. A sleek, black sedan pulled out from a side street, keeping a steady distance behind them. "We're being followed," Sapphire said, her voice rising in panic. "I know," Jack said, shifting gears. "Hold on to the kid. This is going to get bumpy." The rain hammered against the roof of the rusty Ford F-150, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown at metal. Inside, the cab smelled of stale tobacco and wet dog, but to Sapphire, it smelled like the only thing keeping her alive. "Hold on!" Jack yelled. He jerked the steering wheel hard to the left. The truck fishtailed on the slick pavement of 4th Avenue, narrowly missing a parked delivery van. Chloe wailed in Sapphire's arms, the sudden motion waking her fully. "Shh, baby, shh," Sapphire whispered, pressing the toddler's face into her shoulder. She looked out the back window. The black sedan was still there, its LED headlights cutting through the gloom like predator eyes. It was closer now. "They're gaining on us," Sapphire shouted. "Can't this thing go any faster?" "She's got the heart of a lion, but the legs of a corgi," Jack grunted, slamming his foot on the accelerator. The engine roared in protest. "Don't worry, I know these streets better than they do. Richard hires ex-military, but they rely on GPS. I rely on potholes." Jack took a sudden, sharp right into an alleyway that looked too narrow for the truck. Mirrors scraped against brick walls with a screech that set Sapphire's teeth on edge. They bounced over overflowing trash cans, debris flying everywhere. The sedan behind them hesitated. It was too wide. "Ha!" Jack barked. "See? Fancy cars don't like tight spaces." He gunned the engine, bursting out the other side of the alley onto a service road near the industrial district of Sodo. He didn't slow down. He wove through the maze of warehouses and shipping containers, taking turns that seemed random but were clearly calculated. After 10 minutes of heart-stopping driving, Jack slowed down. He pulled the truck into the shadow of a massive rusted crane near the docks. He cut the engine. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. "Did we lose them?" Sapphire asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack watched the rearview mirror for a full minute. "For now. But they have resources. We can't stay on the road." He turned to look at her. In the dim light of the dashboard, his face was rugged, lined with years of stress. "You okay, kid?" "No," Sapphire said bluntly. "I'm not okay. I'm homeless, I'm being hunted, and I have a baby. Who are these people, Jack? Really?" "They're cleaners," Jack said, pulling a pack of cigarettes out, but not lighting one. "Richard Caldwell doesn't get his hands dirty. He pays people to scrub his problems away. And right now, you're a very big stain on his inheritance." "I don't want the money," Sapphire said, tears welling up again. "I just want to be safe. I'll sign it over. I'll give it all to them." Jack laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You think this is about the money? Sapphire, Arthur didn't just leave you a bank account. He left you the company, the control. Richard and Beatrice have been looting Caldwell Logistics for years. If you take over, you see the books. You see the crimes. They can't let you live, not because they want the cash, but because they don't want to go to prison." Sapphire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Arthur knew?" "Arthur knew everything," Jack said. "Come on. We're here." "Here?" Sapphire looked around. They were in a desolate shipyard. Jack got out and walked toward a stack of red shipping containers that looked abandoned. He walked to the third one in the stack, which was accessible by a metal staircase. He punched a code into a hidden keypad behind a rusted flap. The heavy steel doors of the container hissed and unlocked. "Welcome to the Fortress of Solitude," Jack said, gesturing for her to follow. Sapphire carried Chloe up the stairs, her legs trembling. She stepped inside the container and gasped. It wasn't a shipping container inside. It was a fully furnished apartment. It was small but warm, There was a kitchenette, a bed, a crib, and walls lined with monitors and filing cabinets. It was insulated and powered by a generator humming softly in the back. "What is this place?" Sapphire asked, stepping onto the plush rug. "Arthur's real home," Jack said, closing the heavy doors and locking them with 3 separate deadbolts. He didn't live at the senior center because he was broke. He lived there to keep an eye on the streets. But this is where he worked. Jack walked over to a kettle and turned it on. "Arthur knew his kids were sharks," Jack explained. "He spent the last 5 years gathering evidence against them. He built this place to keep the files safe. He told me, 'Jack, the day I die, you find the heir, and you bring them here.'" Sapphire walked over to the wall of monitors. Some were dark, but one showed a live feed of the diner, Miller's. Another showed the entrance to the Holloway law firm. "He was watching?" Sapphire asked. "He was looking for someone," Jack corrected. "He told me he needed someone who understood what it felt like to be invisible. He tried 3 other people before you. One guy stole the wallet. Another guy called the cops. A woman ignored him entirely." Jack handed Sapphire a mug of hot tea. "You were the only one who saw him, Sapphire. Not a bum, not a mark, just a man." Sapphire sat on the edge of the bed, Chloe falling back asleep in her lap. "So what do we do now? Live in a box forever?" "No," Jack said. He walked over to a large metal safe in the corner. He spun the dial. "Now, we wait for Holloway, and we prepare for war." He opened the safe. Inside, there were no stacks of cash. There were stacks of hard drives, and a single thick leather binder labeled "The Sins of the Father." "Arthur left you the gun," Jack said, tapping the binder. "You just have to be brave enough to pull the trigger." The morning sun didn't penetrate the steel walls of the shipping container. Sapphire woke up to the smell of frying bacon. For a split second, she thought she was back at the diner, late for a shift. Then, the metal ceiling reminded her of her reality. Chloe was awake, standing in the crib Jack had miraculously produced from a storage closet, babbling at a blinking LED light on the wall. "Morning," Jack said. He was standing by the kitchenette, flipping eggs. He looked like he hadn't slept. A shotgun was leaning against the counter next to the salt shaker. "Did you sleep?" Sapphire asked, rubbing her eyes. "Slept when I was in the Navy," Jack grunted. "Haven't seen the point since. Eat up. Holloway is coming in an hour." Sapphire fed Chloe and ate the eggs, though her stomach was in knots. She felt cut off from the world. "Can I turn on the TV?" she asked, gesturing to a small flat screen mounted in the corner. "I wouldn't," Jack said. "Why?" "Because you're famous." Sapphire grabbed the remote and turned it on. It was tuned to a local Seattle news channel. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking news. Elder abuse, scandal rocks Caldwell dynasty." Sapphire's breath hitched. On the screen was a photo of her. It was her employee ID photo from Miller's diner, unflattering, tired, and harsh. The news anchor, a woman with compassionate eyes that felt entirely fake, was speaking solemnly. Allegations have surfaced regarding the final days of shipping magnate Arthur Caldwell. Sources close to the family claim that a local waitress, Sapphire Bennett, may have coerced the elderly billionaire who was suffering from advanced dementia into changing his will just hours before his death. The screen cut to a clip of Richard Caldwell. He was standing on the steps of the courthouse, looking devastated. He wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. "We are heartbroken," Richard told the cameras. "My father was a brilliant man, but in his final months, he was confused. He wandered away from his care facility. We believe this woman, this predator, took advantage of his confusion. We are petitioning the court to freeze all assets and have launched a criminal investigation into Miss Bennett for fraud and elder abuse." Sapphire shut off the TV. She felt like she was going to throw up. "Predator," she whispered. "I bought him meatloaf." "It's a narrative," Jack said calmly. "They own the media outlets. Or at least they buy enough ad space to control the story. They're trying to flush you out. If you go to the police to defend yourself, they'll have you arrested on trumped-up charges before you can say lawyer." "They're winning," Sapphire said, putting her head in her hands. "Everyone will hate me. I'll never get a job again." Suddenly, there was a rhythmic knocking on the steel door. "Knock, knock, pause, knock." Jack grabbed the shotgun. He checked a monitor. "It's Holloway," he said. He lowered the weapon and unlocked the door. Robert Holloway stepped in, shaking off a wet umbrella. He looked more disheveled than he had the day before. His tie was loosened, and he had dark circles under his eyes. "Good morning," Holloway said grimly. "I see you've watched the news." "They're lying," Sapphire cried. "Of course they are," Holloway said, setting his briefcase down. "But in the court of public opinion, a lie travels halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes." "We have a problem, Sapphire. The judge granted an emergency injunction this morning. The assets are frozen. So I can't fight them." "Not with money," Holloway said. "But we have something better." He looked at Jack. "Did you show her?" Jack nodded toward the leather binder on the table. "The sins of the father." Holloway sat down and opened the binder. He spread out documents on the small table. "Sapphire, you need to understand what Arthur did. He built Caldwell Logistics from nothing. But about 10 years ago, he stepped back to care for his dying wife. He left Richard and Beatrice in charge." Holloway pointed to a spreadsheet. "They started using the shipping containers for things other than legal goods. They were moving off-book cargo, electronic waste to illegally dump in developing countries, counterfeit pharmaceuticals, and they were laundering the profits through shell companies." Sapphire looked at the numbers. They were astronomical. "Arthur found out?" "He found out 6 months ago," Holloway said. "He confronted them. They threatened to have him declared incompetent and locked away in a high-security asylum. That's when he ran. That's when he went to the St. Jude Center." "Why didn't he just go to the police?" Sapphire asked. "He was dying," Holloway said softly, "and he was ashamed. He felt responsible. He wanted to fix it, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed an heir who was pure, someone who couldn't be bought." Holloway looked at Sapphire intensely. "This binder contains the locations of the servers where the digital trail is hidden. It contains bank account numbers in the Caymans, but it's encrypted. We have the lock, but we don't have the key." "Where is the key?" Jack asked. Holloway hesitated. "Arthur told me the key was where it all began. I assumed he meant his first office, but I checked. Nothing. Then I thought he meant his childhood home. Nothing." Sapphire frowned. "Where it all began." She thought about the old man, the way he ate his meatloaf, the way he drew the sparrow. Even the smallest bird has value. She reached into her pocket. She still had the crumbled drawing he had left her on the napkin. She smoothed it out on the table. "He drew this," Sapphire said. "He left it for me." Holloway looked at the sketch. "A sparrow. Nice. But not a password." "No," Sapphire said, staring at the drawing. "Look at the branch the bird is sitting on. It's not just a line. It's jagged." She leaned closer. The lines of the branch weren't random ink strokes. They were numbers, tiny microscopic numbers hidden in the cross-hatching of the pen. "Jack, do you have a magnifying glass?" Sapphire asked. Jack rummaged in a drawer and handed her a loupe. Sapphire held it over the drawing. 47, 21, 9999, 04. Sapphire read the numbers out loud. "It's a sequence." Holloway's eyes widened. He grabbed his laptop and pulled up the encrypted file from the hard drive. He typed in the numbers. "Access denied." "It's not enough," Holloway said, deflating. "It's only part of the code." Sapphire stared at the drawing again. Where it all began. Miller's Diner, Sapphire realized. That's where our relationship began. That's where he found me. "Miller's?" Jack asked. "You think he hid something in the diner?" He was patting his pockets, Sapphire remembered, her mind racing back to that night. Before he stood up to say he lost his wallet. He wasn't looking for his wallet. He was planting something. "The booth," Sapphire said, standing up. "Corner booth, under the table, or in the seat." "We have to go back," Jack said, grabbing his keys. "It's suicide," Holloway warned. "Richard will be watching the diner. He knows you work there. He probably has men stationed outside." "Then we have to be smarter than them," Sapphire said. Her fear was evaporating, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She looked at Chloe, playing safely on the floor. "They took my home. They threatened my child. I'm not running anymore." She turned to Jack. "You said you know this city's underbelly. Can you get us into Miller's without using the front door?" Jack grinned, a wolfish smile. "The diner has a basement delivery hatch that opens into the alley. It hasn't been used since 1990. It'll be welded shut. Can you open it?" "Sapphire," Jack said, checking the load on his shotgun. "I can open anything." "Mr. Holloway," Sapphire said, turning to the lawyer. "Get the press ready, not the local news. Call the New York Times. Call the FBI. If we find this key, I want the whole world watching when we turn it." "I'll make the calls," Holloway said, looking at Sapphire with a newfound respect. "But Sapphire, if you get caught, I can't help you." "I know," Sapphire said. She picked up her coat. "Let's go get my $18.50 worth." The alley behind Miller's Diner was a throat of darkness, smelling of wet cardboard and old grease. It was 2:15 a.m. Jack killed the headlights of the truck 3 blocks away, and they moved toward the building like ghosts. "Stay behind me," Jack whispered, gripping a crowbar. "Richard's security is professional. If they see us, they won't ask for ID." They reached the rusted delivery hatch near the foundation. Jack worked the crowbar into the seam, applying steady pressure until the ancient latch snapped with a dull thud. He lifted the grate, revealing a black maw leading into the basement. Sapphire dropped into the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. They navigated the maze of the basement, creeping up the wooden stairs to the kitchen. Jack pushed the door open a crack. The diner was silent, illuminated only by the streetlights filtering through the rain-streaked windows. "Booth 4!" Jack hissed. "Go!" Sapphire crawled across the greasy linoleum, keeping low. She reached the corner booth, Arthur's booth. She slid underneath the table, clicking on her penlight. She scanned the chewing gum and scratches until she saw it. Etched into the metal wall bracket with a diamond-tipped tool was a string of characters. 77, Bristol 04 Echo. "I found it," she breathed. She pulled out her phone and snapped a picture. Click. The flash lit up the darkness for a split second. "Gotcha!" a voice boomed. The overhead lights flooded the room, blindingly bright. Sapphire scrambled out, shielding her eyes. Richard Caldwell stood by the entrance, flanked by 2 armed men in tactical gear. "Drop it, Jack!" a guard shouted, leveling a pistol at Jack as he burst from the kitchen. Jack froze, seeing the laser sight dancing on Sapphire's chest. He slowly lowered his weapon. "I knew you'd come back," Richard sneered, walking toward Sapphire. The corporate veneer was gone. He looked manic, his eyes rimmed with red. "Give me the phone." Sapphire hesitated, then handed it over. Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He looked at the photo, then threw the phone onto the tiled floor. He brought his heel down, stomping until the device was nothing but shattered glass and twisted metal. "There," Richard panted. "No code, no evidence. You have nothing, Sapphire. You're just a waitress who got greedy." "You can't hide the truth," Sapphire said, her voice shaking but defiant. "We know about the smuggling, the illegal dumping, the money laundering." "Who cares what you know?" Richard roared. "Without those files, it's hearsay. I built this empire. I did what was necessary to save the company while my father was trying to give it away to charity. So what if I broke a few laws? I won!" He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "And you lost. I'm going to bury you in lawsuits. And your daughter, Chloe? I'll make sure she disappears into the foster system, so deep you'll never find her." Sapphire stared at him. Then a small, sad smile touched her lips. "You're right, Richard. I am just a waitress. But you forgot one thing about us." "And what is that?" "We're paid to listen." Sapphire reached into her hoodie pocket. She didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small, old-school digital voice recorder. The red light was blinking steadily. "I didn't need the phone," she said clearly. "I just needed you to confess." Richard's face turned the color of ash. He lunged for her. "Give me that!" Crash. The front window shattered inward. "Federal agents, down, now!" Stun grenades rolled across the floor, detonating with blinding flashes. Smoke filled the room. Richard's guards instantly dropped their weapons, raising their hands. Robert Holloway stepped through the broken door, flanked by a team of FBI agents. He walked calmly through the smoke to where Richard stood frozen. "Mr. Caldwell," Holloway said, taking the recorder from Sapphire's hand. "I believe this belongs to the state's evidence locker." You can't," Richard stammered, as agents slammed him against the counter. "And regarding the code," Holloway added, tapping his temple, "Miss Bennett was smart enough to recite it to me before she even entered the building. My team decrypted the files 10 minutes ago. We have the ledgers, Richard. We have the emails. It's over." Richard slumped, watching Sapphire with a look of hollow horror. "Why?" he whispered. "Why did he pick you?" Sapphire looked at the man who had tried to destroy her life, then down at her hands that had scrubbed tables and counted pennies to survive. "Because I fed him," Sapphire said simply, "and you let him starve." As the agents hauled Richard away, Jack walked over and placed a hand on Sapphire's shoulder. He was grinning. "You did good, kid. Arthur would be proud." Sapphire took a deep breath, the heavy weight on her chest finally lifting. She looked out the broken window where the sun was just beginning to rise over Seattle. "Let's go, Jack," she said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I need to go pick up my daughter." They say money changes people, but for Sapphire Bennett, it just revealed who she really was. Richard Caldwell had millions, yet he was spiritually bankrupt. Sapphire had $18.50, and she was the richest soul in the room. Arthur Caldwell's final test wasn't about business, it was about the heart. In a world obsessed with status, Sapphire proved that the most powerful currency is kindness. If you enjoyed this story, please hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Thanks for watching. And remember, be kind, because you never know who you're really serving. See you next time.